Livia, thanks for joining us in the studio this morning. The death of Navalny, we don't know if it was planned. We don't know what the details are yet. But is this a sign, the way that the Kremlin's dealing with this, is it a sign of strength or a sign of weakness? What are the implications for Putin and his regime?
I mean, the death of Navalny in prison, the way Putin is using it, he's sending a clear message to his domestic audience in Russia, but also to the international community, to the U.S., to the NATO, that his power is absolute. He is able to take down a member of the opposition, the most prominent member of the opposition, and knows that there's unlikely to be any retribution.
Well, on that question of retribution, the U.S. previously had promised and pledged a pretty strong response. We have to think about the EU as well, as whether there are additional measures that Brussels can take. What would you expect the response to be from Washington, from Brussels in the days and weeks ahead, if any?
It's very difficult for the West to take any further repercussions against Russia at the moment. We have a huge number of sanctions against Russia, yet still the Russian economy has showed that there's been some growth, according to the IMF, notwithstanding sanctions. There's been several diplomatic expulsions over the years. Without further sanctioning commodities, oil and gas trade, it is difficult to see what they can actually do to punish Putin at this point without having further implications for the global economy, such as sanctioning oil.
And Navalny himself, clearly incredibly courageous, incredibly brave individual. How representative, though, was he of sentiment in Russia, opposition in Russia? How much opposition is there at this point? How easy or difficult is it to gauge the opposition to Putin and his government?
Navalny, even at his peak, showed sort of that he had about 14% approval ratings, which is not significant. I mean, it's not insignificant, but it shows that still he was not going to ever pose a real threat to Putin, let's say, in the elections. That said, it's what Navalny really represented as an ideological alternative to Putin. He was an anti-corruption crusader. He was modern. He was young. And what he really represented was what Russia could be, and that was a huge ideological representation, what Russians could have. That said, he never really stood a chance. But right now, with the war in Ukraine, many of the liberal elite in Russia have left as well. So it's going to be very difficult for there to be a real opposition against Putin in the upcoming months, with his organization without a head.
And meanwhile, Russia making some territorial gains over the last 48 hours or so in Ukraine. What do we make of that, the significance? And what does it tell us about the strategy of the Russians at this point? Are they still aiming for complete territorial conquest of Ukraine, or are they aiming to get it to a point where they have leverage to get around the table and push for a ceasefire that ends up with them getting some significant advantage?
Putin's strategy is to be in Ukraine in the long term and to keep making advances and to wear down the West. This has been a strategy from the beginning, and things like the conflict in Israel, the stalling of aid for Ukraine. These are things that really work in Putin's favor. He is there to ultimately take what he can. The entire economy has been geared up for defense spending at the moment, building weaponry, and I think that as long as he can keep making advances, he will, and that is very clear how he's set up the strategy.
And we know that the spending package in Washington is stalled, and we don't know if the prospects are looking bright. We don't know if they're going to be able to get that across the line because of opposition from some Republicans. What do we know of the ability for Ukraine to sustain its defense without that backing from the U.S.? What kind of timeline are we looking at?
Zelensky's made it very clear that without that aid, it is very difficult for them to continue on fighting. He's talked about, 3 months, 6 months, but ultimately they really do need that military aid. They need the weaponry. We've already seen that Russia's made advances without that, and certainly Russia has the upper hand right now. But ahead of the U.S. elections, it's very difficult for the U.S. to be approving major aid bills for the Ukraine, and we're likely to see it stalling over the next few months.